for a podcast and for a live stream. So if you could be kind enough, if you have anything to do, if you could take it outside or anything like that, feel free to come up. And if you get some food or whatnot, don't crunch it up on all that stuff. Uh, uh, we will have like a question and answer and opportunity for audience participation as well. So when you ask the question, it won't pick up on there, but the authors will repeat the question and then go from there. Outside of that, I hope everybody enjoys. I'll go ahead and hand over to Sarah, who will start off in just a little bit. Thank you very much.
Coordinator here for the Latino collection. We are super excited to be hosting Reyna Grande and Omar Valerio-Jimenez to share details about their books. And want to thank Rodrigo for being here. Again, I just wanted to reiterate for the people who just got in here, just kindly turn off your cell phones, just we're recording the event. So we have some free Latino collection merch back on that table, some mugs, pouches, things like that, and some finger foods and beverages in the back. So help yourself to it. And I'm going to turn it over to Omar and Reyna. Enjoy.
Okay. Well, thank you. I'm Omar Valerio-Jimenez. I'm a professor at the University of Texas at San Antonio, and it's a pleasure to be here. And it was great to have Reyna and Tony invite me to this. I first met Reyna when I was a professor at the University of Iowa, when she was discussing a previous book. And so anyway, I was asked to speak about a short sort of overview of the Texas Rangers and also to talk about their legacies. So I'm going to do that, and I'm just going to select a few episodes. I'm not an expert on the Texas Rangers, but as some of you see from my book, I discuss them in my book, in my first book. So anyway, and I'm also going to be wary of the time because as a historian, as a scholar in general, we talk and we forget about the time. So just you can tell me to. I'll tell myself 15 minutes. Okay. So so the Texas Rangers, began in the 19th century, right? They're created in the 19th century, and as historian Andres Tijerina has explained, the model of a small sort of mounted force of armed scouts originated in Spain and was brought over to the Americas by the Spanish colonists, and so they called it the compañías volantes, or flying squadrons, and they were made up usually of 6 to 8 men, light mounted cavalry, very mobile, and they were basically used to patrol the frontier to defend against so-called enemy Indians. And these flying squadrons were usually composed of local volunteers and were highly skilled in frontier defenses. And in Mexican Texas, Tejanos established flying squadrons in various places like San Antonio, Laredo, Victoria. And Tijerina, Andres Tijerina argues that these flying squadrons were the models for the squadrons that were created by Anglo-Americans as they arrived in Texas, and they began calling them the Rangers. So Anglo-American colonization officially began in 1821, And Stephen F. Austin hired the first 10 Rangers in 1823, so 2 years later, to conduct sort of a hostile campaign against Indians. However, the state of Texas, or the officially, it wasn't the state of Texas yet, the official sort of designation as the Texas Rangers didn't begin until 1835, when they were officially established with a group of 56 men. Nevertheless, because the first sort of group of Rangers were created or organized in 1823, this year marks the 200th anniversary. The state has decided that's the 200th anniversary of the Texas Rangers. So what was their role? And I'm going to talk about various episodes. So one of them is during the Texas Revolution. So during the Texas Separatist Revolt, as Raul Ramos has called the Texas Revolution, the Texas Rangers served as scouts and couriers. They didn't really engage in major battles, but instead they sort of complemented the main rebel forces by providing assistance to Anglo-Americans fleeing from the Mexican army and gathering cattle and other things that were left behind by these fleeing civilians. So they really became more of a more prominent during the Texas Republic after 1836, especially after Mirabeau Lamar became president, because unlike the Sam Houston who had been president before him, Lamar basically changed the sort of policy towards Native Americans, and he decided to institute a sort of a very hostile policy of extermination, basically. So Lamar expanded the Texas Ranger Force to 13 companies to engage in war against various Indian nations, including the Cherokees and the Comanches in Central and East Texas. And in addition to these punitive expeditions against Native American groups, the Rangers were also deployed against the Mexican Army when Mexican Army attempted to retake San Antonio in 1842. Just a brief background, for those who might not remember Texas history. So the Mexican government never recognized Texas independence and believed Texas was still theirs, right? And so in 1842, a Mexican army enters San Antonio to try to retake it, and does retake it for a few days, but then has to give up. But during the Republic period, the Texas Rangers obtained a lot of experience fighting Native American groups, and basically, as a cavalry unit. And this experience is going to become very useful during the U.S.-Mexico War, as you read in Reyna Grande's book. So, especially because the U.S. Army, the regular U.S. Soldiers didn't have much experience in northern Mexico and didn't know about the geography of northern Mexico. So, as you saw in the Ballad of Love and Glory, the Rangers become scouts for the invading U.S. Army as they move into northern Mexico. And they're very critical at the first two battles, the first two official battles at Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma in May of 1846, which is near present-day Brownsville. And they play pivotal roles in various, as the U.S. Army marches into northern Mexico and then central Mexico, right? In Monterrey, they scout to figure out what's the best approach into Monterrey, and they're very sort of significant, and Taylor becomes very how do I say this? Acknowledges that they're very useful, even though he also acknowledges at the end of the war that they're very hard to control, right? And as you read in Ballad of Love and Glory, they are also responsible for many depredations, a lot of hostilities, rapes, the sort of the abuse of the civilian population, the desecration of churches, and so forth. This occurs. It also occurs, it's not just by the Texas Rangers, but also by some of the volunteers that join the U.S. Army that aren't regular U.S. soldiers, but are volunteer soldiers. And they're not used to waiting for long periods of time to get get instructions on what to do next. And when they're waiting, they end up doing what soldiers throughout the world do, which is when they're not very well controlled, which is they commit abuses against civilian population. So anyway, but I'll leave that to discuss perhaps later, and when we talk to Reyna Grande. But anyway, many of the scenes that she depicts and many of the events that she depicts are based in real life. I mean, this is really what happened, right? So during the second half of the 19th century, the U.S. Army and the Texas Rangers are used in other episodes, most famously, well, several episodes in the second half of the 19th century to suppress an 1859 rebellion by Juan Cortina, the same Juan Cortina that's in the book, okay, as he leads a rebellion of Mexican Americans, Tejanos, and Mexican citizens against local officials, because he believes, Cortina and some of his followers believe, that the U.S. is not respecting the rights of Mexican Americans, the civil rights of Mexican Americans. I discuss it briefly in my book. And in the 1880s, in the late 1880s, they're also used against Catarino Garza, who is a rebel who tries to organize a rebellion against Porfirio Diaz, but based in South Texas. So they're used against him as well. And then at the turn of the century, right, in 1901, they're also famously used to pursue and capture. They're part of the hundreds of men who pursue and capture Gregorio Cortés, the famous Gregorio Cortés that Américo Paredes speaks about. But as Mexican Americans and Mexican American historians, perhaps their legacy is most probably prominent in our minds, with respect to the bloody decade of the 1910s, 1920. Okay, this is during the time of the Mexican Revolution going on in Mexico, but it's also a time when there's a sort of state-sanctioned violence targeting ethnic Mexicans in Texas. Several historians have written about this: David Montejano, Miguel Levario, Ben Johnson, Monica Munoz Martinez, in her most recent award-winning book, have written about this. And scholars estimate that several thousands of ethnic Mexicans were killed during this decade. The revolution in Mexico led obviously to a lot of people fleeing, civilians fleeing. They fled Mexico to the U.S. This is one of the largest migrations of Mexicans into the U.S. And because of that, because of the arrival of many immigrants, as well as the actions of various revolutionary factions in Mexico along the border, including Pancho Villa and his men, there was a lot of tension along the border. And so the state of Texas deploys the Texas Rangers to target so-called bandits, and rebels and so forth. And so what ends up happening is there's a lot of the Rangers engaged during this period in indiscriminate violence. Revolutionaries in Mexico who cross into Texas, but as well as civilians. And so this is one of the sort of darkest period in various historians, as I mentioned, have described this, but more perhaps one of the most recent books that discuss this is Benjamin Johnson's Revolution in Texas, where he describes the turmoil and the sort of the unleashing of state-sanctioned violence against Tejanos. Partly, it began in 1910, but it increases dramatically in 1915 as a result of the scattered attacks that begin in South Texas by rebels that are Tejanos, who are seeking sort of a slightly different goal than Mexican revolutionaries, and that is they are trying to establish a separate republic throughout the U.S. Southwest. They issue a plan that they call the Plan de San Diego, named after San Diego, Texas, which is near Corpus Christi. And in that plan, they call for a liberating army of all races, and composed of including Mexicans, African Americans, American Indians, and their manifesto, the Plan de San Diego, calls for their liberating army to kill all white males over 16 years of age and to overthrow U.S. rule in the U.S. Southwest, right? And to form an independent republic, and perhaps later that republic could be reincorporated into Mexico. That was the plan, right? The rebels kill a few people. They launch attacks against ranches, against railroads, against irrigation canals, but it wasn't actually that their violence wasn't actually that significant. But what was significant was the counter attack. The reprisals that occurred, and the Texas Rangers played a key role in this by killing rebels and civilians alike, driving Mexican. David Montejano has argued the violence against Mexican ranchers led to their dispossession because they fled their ranches, and as a result, newcomers, Anglo-American newcomers who became farmers, basically were able to acquire some of their land as these ranchers fled into Mexico. So one of the most famous sort of acts of violence committed by the Rangers was something called the Porvenir Massacre in West Texas, where the Texas Rangers rounded up about 15 unarmed men and boys and massacred them. And as a result, the surviving family members fled to Mexico and sought help from the Mexican government. So, in response to this violence that was taking place in the mid 1915 and beyond, several elected officials, lawyers, and sheriffs even in the Rio Grande Valley protested the state authorities. The most famous protest came from State Representative Jose P. Canales, who he was the only Mexican American legislator in the 1910s, and he held state hearings in Austin about sort of to investigate these outrages committed by the Rangers. Canales' hearings and his proposed legislation, it didn't pass, his bill didn't pass, but it managed to eliminate one of the ranger companies, to reduce their number, and to establish a set of guidelines and procedures in hiring, because Canales believed, as well as did others, that people who were serving, the men who were serving in the Rangers force, weren't really trained well, and that's what was leading to some of these abuses. Most importantly, the transcripts of this Canales hearings, which included testimonies of survivors, depositions, and local government reports, were deposited at the Texas State Archives, but were not available, coincidentally, to anyone except a few select scholars like Walter Prescott Webb until the mid-1970s. So they were stored at the Texas State Archives, and no one was allowed access to them except a few historians. But the hearings, the transcripts did survive, and they were eventually open to other scholars. Ben Johnson used it, Richard Ribb used them, and most recently, a group of scholars have used them to re-examine the role of the Texas Rangers. And in one of the most recent books, an anthology called Reverberations of Racial Violence, edited by Sonia Hernandez, who's a professor at Texas A&M, and John Moran Gonzalez, who's a professor at UT Austin. So quickly, I'll just mention what they did in the 20th century. So in the 20th century, the Rangers were used to suppress Tejano and African American voters in various parts in East Texas and South Texas. They were also used against striking farm workers in South Texas, in Starr County. They were used against the NAACP. During the Chicano movement, they were the Rangers arrested and beat striking farm workers and striking activists associated with La Raza Unida Party, associated as well with PASO in Crystal City, the political association of Spanish-speaking organizations. So, and I'm just wrap it up here. So what's the legacy? So one of the things I think the legacy for Mexican Americans is it's very conflicted, right? Because as I mentioned, Tijerina and other historians have said that Spanish colonists and Mexican colonists were the ones who sort of had this idea of creating, flying squadrons that the Rangers are modeled after. The Rangers did provide sort of what we would call protection against Native Americans, right? And so, Mexican American or Tejanos who lived in San Antonio, who lived in Laredo, benefited from that as well. But yet they also were responsible. The Rangers were responsible for, violence, for killings, for suppressing organizations and activism, and for suppressing the vote. One of the things that has happened in sort of in gearing up to this 200th anniversary is activists have created and scholars have created an organization called Refusing to Forget. It's an organization mainly a few other scholars like John Moran Gonzalez, who's a literature professor. And what they did in 2016 is create an exhibit called, let me see what it's called. What is it called? Life and Death on the Border, 1910 to 1920. And that was exhibited at the Bullock Museum in Austin. And since then, the Refusing to Forget project has created a traveling exhibit. The traveling exhibit was in South Texas at the South Texas College in McAllen. And starting in October of this year, 2023, it's going to be hosted by the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center here in San Antonio from October until January 2024. And then in November of 2024 until February of 2025, it will be at the Houston Holocaust Museum. So if you're interested in seeing this, I really encourage you to go to the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center. You can get a glimpse of what some of the exhibits and what some of the history of this this exhibit by going to the refusingtoforget.org website. So it's just refusing to forget, all one word, .org. And then one of the things that happened recently is in 2020, as a result of a book that was about to be published on the Rangers, or that I think was published on the Rangers, Dallas Love Field, if any of you remember flying through Dallas Love Field, there used to be a statue of a Texas Ranger there. And it got removed in 2020, partly as a result of activism, by African American and Tejanos, Mexican Americans interested in promoting civil rights. And as a result of this scholarship and protest, officials decided it was best to remove that statue. The statue actually depicted a Texas Ranger that had been responsible for a campaign to stop the integration of a school in Mansfield, Texas. So this renewed focus on the Texas Rangers and some of their abuses, either through scholarship and as well as through the removal of the statue, has also given sort of a little bit some motivation to some other activists, especially some Mexican American activists who are perhaps who have called for the renaming of the baseball team, the Texas Rangers, right, as well. So this, is part of the legacy, I think, sort of a rethinking of the place, the Texas Rangers in history. And I'll stop there. So this is.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for that wonderful lecture on the Rangers.
Sorry.
It's so well, the talk. It was really informative, and it's important too, to think about the history of the Rangers, to see it from a different point of view, right, and not in a way that has been romanticized. Like that's the way we have heard so much about the Rangers, but it's also good to bring in some other point of views. And that's something that also I thought about as I was writing my novel, A Ballad of Love and Glory, that you get to learn about the Rangers and their role during the Mexican-American War. And I wrote a novel because I'm a novelist. I'm not a historian. And so I decided that I really wanted to learn more about this history that I didn't learn in school. And when I started the novel, I really had didn't have much knowledge to K through 12. My teacher skipped over the Mexican American War. And so I grew up not really learning much about it. It wasn't until I got to college, I was at UC Santa Cruz, when I took a history of Mexico class. And that is where my professor uh, talked about the U.S. invasion of Mexico that led to Mexico losing over half of its territory. And that was when it entered my consciousness, like, oh, wait a minute, like we lost all this land. And California, that has been my home for decades, used to be Mexican land. And understanding that, learning about that, it helped me to start thinking about who I am as a Mexican, as a Spanish speaker. And when this was back in 2013. The reason why I started to write this novel was because somebody told me the story of the St. Patrick's Battalion. I don't know, raise your hand if you guys know the story of the San Patricios. Yeah, some people do. So I didn't know anything about the San Patricios. I had never heard about them, but somebody told me about John Riley and the St. Patrick's Battalion, which was a unit in the Mexican army composed of deserters from the U.S. Army, and many of them were Irish, as was their leader, John Riley. And these deserters decided to switch and fight for Mexico, and they gave their lives for Mexico because 50 of them were eventually hanged by the U.S. Army. And I was very intrigued when I heard about the San Patricios. I wanted to learn more about them and answer the question, like, why did they do it? Why did they want to help Mexico defend itself against the U.S.? Why were they willing to give their lives for Mexico? And that's how it began for me. And then, of course, for me, writing this novel was a way of learning the history that I didn't know. And I embarked on this 7-year journey. I read many, many books. I consulted with historians, and that's how I met you, because I reached out to you, and I was trying to learn as much as I could about the war. And as I started to write the novel, I began to get more understanding about all the historical moments that led to the U.S. invading Mexico and the participants of this war from both sides, from the U.S. and the Mexican side. And then, of course, as I began to write the novel, the Rangers were a part of the story because they came down with Taylor to the Rio Grande as volunteers. And the more I read about the war, the more I understood what the Rangers were doing at that time and how they were there basically to seek revenge, right, for what had happened at the Alamo, for what happened at Goliad, at Mier. And so they were there specifically to seek revenge against Mexicans. And as Omar mentioned, like, there were all kinds of depredations. They violated women. They burned ranches. They killed indiscriminately, and they caused all kinds of mayhem. And General Taylor couldn't control them at all. They were just running wild all over the Mexican countryside, doing all kinds of things. So in the novel, um, my two protagonists are John Riley, who's a real historical figure, the leader of the St. Patrick's Battalion. And when you first meet him in the novel, he's still in the U.S. Army as a private, and they're camped out along the Rio Grande, and he's starting to have second thoughts about fighting for the U.S. And he finds a lot of connections with Mexico and Ireland because, as you know, Ireland had been oppressed by the English for 2 centuries. The Irish had been dispossessed of their lands, and John Riley feels that Mexico is going to be turned into another Ireland, being oppressed by an Anglo Saxon Protestant nation, and that the Mexican people are also going to be dispossessed of their lands. So that's where you meet him, where he's starting to have this existential crisis about loyalty and where he belongs. The other character you meet in the novel is Jimena, who is a woman from San Antonio whose family was displaced after the Texas Rebellion. And she ends up moving to the Rio Grande region where she marries and she owns a ranch with her husband. And when the war begins, when General Taylor arrives with his troops, her husband Joaquin joins the guerrilla, encouraged by Juan Cortina, and he starts fighting with the guerrilla, and eventually he gets killed by the Texas Rangers. And Jimena's ranch is burned down to the ground, and that's when she joins the Mexican army as a nurse in the army. So and that's where John Riley and Jimena meet. And then from there you get to see the war unfolding through their eyes and as they're trying to survive the war. The book begins along the Rio Grande with the first battles, the Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma, and then you go to Monterrey, and then it goes to San Luis Potosí, then you get to hear what happens in Veracruz, and then the culminating part of the novel, the climax, takes place in Mexico City when the U.S. Army takes possession of Mexico City and the San Patricios are captured and hanged at the gallows. So that's what the novel is about. It really immerses the reader during these 2 years of the invasion. You get to like meet all these historical figures, like Santa Anna plays a big part in the novel, and you get to meet him halfway when the army goes down to San Luis Potosí. And one of the biggest surprises for me, of course, was first, I didn't know how to write a historical novel because I had never done it before. And I was very intimidated by the project. That's why it took me 7 years. I tried to abandon it several times, and it always called back to me. John Riley, Jimena, they always call back to me. And after abandoning it like for a year, I'll say, okay, I need to go back to it because they're calling me. And then I'll like work on it a little more, get overwhelmed by it again, and then put it aside. And then a few months later, they're calling me again. So I eventually managed to turn things around where I went from thinking it belonged in the trash because it was so terrible to then loving the novel and saying, this is the best thing I've ever written. So yeah, so that was my journey of writing this novel. So I want to share a little excerpt with you before Omar and I get into a conversation. And the excerpt I'm going to read to you takes place in Monterrey and right after the Battle of Monterrey, which, as you know, I'm not going to ruin the book for you when I tell you that the Mexicans lost every battle in this war. So the Mexicans have just lost the Battle of Monterrey, and John Riley is on his way to go talk to his men. And the one of the characters that's important for you to know a little bit about is Jimmy Maloney, who is an older man. He's 65 years old, which back then was considered old for a soldier. And John Riley and Maloney had deserted the U.S. Army, and they were fighting for the Mexican army. And he's a really beautiful character in the book. He's actually one of my favorite characters, Jimmy Maloney, because he was just such a sweet man, and I loved writing the scenes that he's in. But here's John Riley traversing the city of Monterrey right after the battle. And if you want to follow along, yeah, sure. It's page, in the hardcover, it's 171. It's chapter 20. I don't know what page it is on the paperback. Yeah. Afterward, Riley made his way to the hospital to check on his wounded men and speak with Maloney. Questions swirled in his head. What would his countrymen say about the capitulation of Monterrey? Would they regret joining the Mexican ranks? Would they blame him? As his horse forced its way over the rubble littering the streets and shell fragments, Riley couldn't help but mourn the injury inflicted upon this beautiful city. The white stone streets stained red, the fallen trees, homes with crumbled walls and doors riddled with bullets, shattered windows and ruined balconies. The grief stricken civilians were walking about, searching for their loved ones, while others were loading what they could of their possessions onto their mules or their own backs. Riley wished to close his eyes to the devastation. What had been gained from these calamities? A premature surrender of the city? At least the terms of the surrender had spared him and his men from their worst fear, being captured by the Yanks, which would have meant sure death. General Taylor had agreed that all Mexican forces would be allowed to withdraw from the city with their arms and a 6-gun battery. He agreed not to pursue the Mexican troops for 8 weeks, so Riley and his men would be allowed to march out of the city in the ranks of the Mexican Army of the North. At least for now, the deserters were safe. As he neared the cathedral, a crowd of civilians were gathered around it. Riley winced at the sight of the destruction inflicted upon this holy place of God, with its damaged clock tower and marred facade. But then he realized what the crowd was looking at. The Texas Rangers, violating the terms of the truce, were filing in and out of the cathedral on their horses, as if it were nothing more than a stable. They came out carrying crucifixes, sacred vessels, wax figures of the Virgin Mother and Child, and religious paintings. One of them was dressed in the sacred vestments. Another was banging on the organ inside, pealing forth the most grotesque sounds. The townspeople pleaded for them to stop. The priests and monks on their knees, with the crucifix in hand, begged them to cease their barbarity and respect the house of the Lord. They simply laughed and continued their plundering. Riley now knew how his people had felt when Oliver Cromwell invaded Ireland 2 centuries earlier, desecrating its churches, using them as stables. The seething rage, the impotence. He heard someone shouting, "Ye infernal scoundrels! 'Tis sacrilege what you're doing. May the curse of God be upon ye." Even before he turned to look, he knew who it was. Maloney emerged from the crowd with the musket in hand and rushed at the Rangers. Riley tried to stop him, but couldn't get through the onlookers quickly enough. Before he could reach his friend, Maloney fired at the Rangers, killing one of them. They trained their deadly 6-shooters on the old man, pouring their bullets into him until they were spent. Riley halted his horse and watched as Maloney's blood spread over the ground. The Rangers reloaded and pointed their Colt revolvers at the onlookers. "Who's next?" they yelled. "Who wants to try to stop us?" The crowd fled, and Riley took advantage of the chaos to try to turn his horse around before the Rangers spotted him. Suddenly, Jimena was there. Seeing Maloney slain on the ground, she screamed. She pushed her way through the crowd, hastening to where he lay, but Riley rushed to intercept her. The Rangers would kill her. He knew it, and when he blocked her path and she looked up at him, she seemed to know it too, for she reached for his hand. He pulled her up onto his horse, and together they galloped away. When they reached the Rio Santa Catarina, they dismounted and she broke down, sobbing. "Wisht, lass, wisht. We'll make them pay for this. I swear." They sat by the river bank and leaned against a boulder. The Sierra Madre range towered over them. Riley realized he no longer wished to live in this city, never wanted to return. Jimena stopped crying but wouldn't utter a word. She stared at the river in dreary stillness and scarcely seemed to breathe. It affrighted him so much that he cupped her chin and turned her face to his. Look at me, lass, he said. I know you love the old fellow. He loved you as well, and he wouldn't be happy to see you falling asunder on account of him. He'll want you to be strong, to carry on. You hear me? She nodded gently. He pulled her into his arms, and it was as if he were gathering an armful of wild lavender and other fragrant herbs, for her delicate aroma was a healing balm on his spirit. They sat there by the river, watching the current swirl and glide past them. A crane swooped overhead and fluttered over the surface of the water, and Riley felt the gust of its flapping wings stirring the air. They beheld its flight as it ascended, weaving through the clouds tinged in gold from the afternoon sun until it was just a speck in the sky. We will lose the war now, yes, she said. The land is lost, and my husband and grandmother are gone, and now Jimmy Maloney is gone too. Nay, we lost the battle, not the war. We will carry on, keep fighting in their honor, he said. She turned to face him, and he took out his handkerchief and wiped the lingering tears on her face. Her eyes red with sorrow, her hair disheveled, and yet she shone with the fierce beauty that overwhelmed him. She cupped his face, her fingers caressing his cheeks, tracing the outline of his bottom lip. With a groan, his mouth fell on hers, and she responded with the same ardor. He could taste the salt in her tears, the bitterness of her grief, then it all faded into the honey sweetness of her desire for him. He tore away from her, suddenly gasping for breath. Ah, we mustn't. 'Tis wrong. She took off the red rosary beads she wore around her neck and put her fingers over them, her voice serene and comforting, like a warm embrace. Creo en Dios, Padre Todopoderoso, Creador del cielo y de la tierra. He leaned his forehead against her and took her hands and the beads into his. They held each other in mutual sorrow, whispering their prayers over the rosary until they could feel Maloney's spirit take flight. A peace settled over them. He held her in his arms a little longer until finally they found the strength to get up and bury their dead. Thank you.
So I'm supposed to ask questions, and based on from a historian point of view. So one of the things I want to say is that this novel combines a lot of information, historical information. And Reyna already mentioned that she did years of research, right? So I'm really impressed with the research that you incorporated into this novel. And even though I knew the outcome of the war, right, I was still captivated by the story and by the developments in each chapter. So it was great. One of the things I liked about the novel is how she incorporates so many topics. And in general, when I teach the U.S. Mexican War, one of the fascinating things for me is how that event, right, crucial event, incorporates a lot of topics in U.S. history. So U.S. westward expansion, the Irish potato famine, push and pull factors, in related to immigration, nativism and anti-Catholicism against the Irish, military service as a path to citizenship. So all these things are incorporated, right? Slavery, yes, exactly. And so what I was impressed with, and what I want to ask you, first question is, so as a historian, we do a lot of research to try to, when we're writing a book or an article or whatever. And one of the hard things for us is, we get all this information and you go, I want to include it all, but you can't, right? Or else it would be a really long book, and no one would read it because it would be too boring. So I wanted to ask Reina, how did you decide what to cut and how, because you read, probably hundreds of books at least, and in several languages. So, how do you decide, like, okay, I'm gonna mention this and not mention that because, you know, I mean, part of it I know is like, well, you wanna uh, fuel the story, right? You wanna keep the story going, so you can't get bogged into details. But how do you know, like, well, am I providing enough detail here?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think for me, what helped me really stay focused on how much or what to include was the fact that I was writing a novel, not a history book. And what I mean by that is that I was writing through the eyes of my characters. So I only included as much as Jimena and John Riley knew and nothing else. And that kind of helped me because as I was reading all these history books, I mean, with the history books, you get to hear like everything, all the details, all the facts. And not only was I reading about all the events that were unfolding in Mexico, but also the stuff that was happening in New Mexico, in California. There were battles that were also being fought on those parts, but my characters were not there. And so, like, I automatically, it's like, okay, I'm not going to write about California. I'm not going to write about what's happening in, New Mexico. I'm only going to focus on where my characters are and what information they have available to them. And for example, even, when I do mention that when U.S. Congress officially declared war on Mexico, that happened May 13, but news didn't get to Jimena until June. And so that's when she mentions it. It's already June. And that's where I mentioned that, the US Congress had declared war in Mexico, but it took a few weeks for the information to reach her. Or same thing with, when I write about the stuff that's happening in California, John Riley briefly mentions it, that there was conflict going on, but I didn't go into detail because he wouldn't have really known how much was really going on because it took about 6 months for all that information to reach them in San Luis Potosi about what was happening in California. So things like that. I was always conscious about what do my characters know, where are they, and how much information is available to them. Mhm.
So another question, which is related. So about a lot of the characters here are real life characters, right? That John Riley, Cortina, Canales, Taylor, obviously Santa Ana. Now, for some of these men, like Taylor or Arista, a lot is known, right? Because they left records, and there was people who wrote about them. Other men like Cortina and Canales and even Riley, there's a lot less known. So one of the questions I wanted to ask is, how did you decide um, to um, to write about some of these episodes? Like we know that Cortina and Canales were guerrilleros that were attacking. They weren't officially part of the Mexican army, but they were attacking the troops, the U.S. troops, as they were going into Mexico, right? But not a whole lot is known. So how did you decide, how to deal with that? Where you know a lot about Santa Ana, you know a lot about Arista and Pudia, right? But these other figures who are real, there's less known about them.
Yeah. Yeah. And when I was researching Juan Cortina, pretty much a lot of the things we know about Juan Cortina is what happened during the Cortina Wars. And when you meet him in my novel, he's 22. He's not the Juan Cortina we have come to know now. He was a young man, and he was, part of the militia, and he comes to Jimena's ranch to recruit her husband. So I had to like think about who was he at the time versus who he became. And so I was not writing about that Juan Cortina. So he's a young man, and but what I did put in the novel about what I learned about Juan Cortina as was his temperament. He was very quick to anger. He was a little impulsive, and some of the conversations or things that he says that I put in dialogue came directly from his proclamations that he would publish during the Cortina Wars. And so there's like little, you get hints of who he's going to become later on, because you get to know him a little bit and know what his politics are, know like what he's angry about. And one of the things that was he was really angry was how the central Mexican government neglected the northern frontier, and how the norteños, were ignored, the plight of the norteños. They were, would ask the Mexican government for help. They would never get it. And so they had to look out for themselves. And this was something that he was very angry about. And you get to hear that in the conversations that he has with Joaquin, that he has with Jimena. So I really had a lot of fun like writing about these historical figures, because I had to understand who they were at the moment that I'm writing about, and not think about like who they're going to become or how we have come to know them now, but try to keep my own biases, not from like my more modern biases, out of the novel, because I'm writing about the 1840s, and this is what my characters think at this moment, and not what Reina Grande thinks that they should think.
Maybe one more, and then we'll open it up. So one of the things that, as a historian, I know is that the two characters, at least Santa Ana, real life characters, and Cortina, haven't been written about in very positive ways. Okay, a lot of the English language, at least, books about Santa Ana, even in Spanish language books about Santa Ana, but definitely about Cortina, have depicted them in really, really negative terms, right? Um, so I wanted to ask you how you came to create a little bit, create both of them. I would say, I would argue, more Cortina than Santana maybe, but as somewhat sympathetic figures, right? Because they come across as sympathetic, as real life characters. Because like Santana and Cortina are often just portrayed in English, until recently, in English language history books, as these one-sided figures, evil, evil Mexicans, corrupt, and basically not really having any values, but just trying to look out for themselves.
Yeah, well, I think that's kind of lazy and boring when we portray a villain just like one dimensional. And I like the way I approach my character, especially Santa Ana, was that I wanted to give him his complexity, and his contradictions. And I really don't like the way he has been depicted in other books or in other films, like the horrible film The Alamo. It's like, no, no, he, to me, like, that's boring and it's lazy writing, right? Not for a writer to not really work on developing their characters and just taking the easy way out and portraying them as this one-dimensional villain. To me, like, I didn't want to do that with my book. So I worked very hard, like especially with Santa Ana. I was very intimidated by writing about him because he's this like bigger than life figure, very controversial. He's like a very hated man, very despised. And I said, okay, how am I gonna approach this guy, and what am I gonna do to make sure that I understand him as a writer? And I read a lot of biographies about Santana in English and Spanish, and then I read his memoirs, and I started to like really hear his voice in my head and to understand who he was. And I knew that a man like Santana, who was president of Mexico 11 times, he had to have been a very complicated man, and he had to have been the kind of man that he could inspire a lot of love from his people and a lot of hate from his people. And then there were times when the Mexican people had parades for him in his honor, and there were portraits of him and statues of him. And then next thing you know, they hate him so much, they're breaking the statues and burning his portraits and kicking him out of the country. And then they love him again, and then they hate him again. And it's like, okay, like, like this guy sounds really, really interesting to me. And that's how he started coming across in the novel. Like you hate him one minute and then you like him the next, and then you hate him again and then you like him again. And so I wanted to elicit in the reader the same feelings that Mexico has had for this man. And I love the energy that he brought into the book, because he actually, by writing about Santana, that was where Jimena finally took on life of her own as a character in the book. Because I struggled with her so much to know who she was, and she was very passive through at the beginning of the book. She's coming across a little passive, and yet when she meets him and he forces her to become his own personal nurse, because as you know, Santana was amputated. His knee was amputated when he was blown off by a French cannon, and he suffered from chronic infection. So he forces Jimena to become his own personal nurse, and that's where they're constantly clashing, and she has to kind of rise up to that level where she has to find that inner strength to butt heads with him and to not let him intimidate her and frighten her. And so that's when, for me, I had this I finally found my groove when it came with Jimena, and it was Santana who brought her out for me and helped me to get to know who she was.
So I think we want to have questions from the audience, and I'm going to step out and just let her take the questions.
Oh, they probably have questions about the Rangers too. Yes. Oh wow. Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah, and that is a question I get a lot, because people think I took a lot of creative license, and that I exaggerated the violence, that I exaggerated the mistreatment of the foreign soldiers. And no, I mean, I just I read all the history books, and also diaries from soldiers who describe all this abuse. And so when I open the book with John Riley's chapter where he's experiencing, he's seeing how other Irishmen are being treated, and the Germans, the Italians, the Poles. I mean, they suffered so much uh, ethnic discrimination, but religious prejudice. And so, because of this mistreatment that they would get, like some of them ended up deserting and switching sides. Yes. Yeah, so the question is about the violence that I depict in the novel towards the Irish and the other immigrant soldiers in the US ranks. Like, did that really happen? And there was a lot of mention of the brandings because um, the US Army would punish these soldiers for drinking. So they would brand them on the forehead with the letters HD for deserters. I mean, for habitual drunkard. And then when later on in the book, when the San Patricios were captured, one of the punishments inflicted upon them was branding them on the cheeks with the letter D for deserters. And John Riley gets branded on both cheeks, not just one. Yeah, and that really happened too. Mhm. Yes. Mhm.
Yeah. So I'll repeat the question or the comment. That's just about how the Texas Rangers, the atrocities committed by the Texas Rangers in the 19th and 20th centuries, how they continue, how the abuses continue as a state police force. And why did they continue? I'm not a political scientist. I'm a historian. But I would say this is one of the things that historians and scholars in general love to sort of seize on, which is what's going on today and how does that relate to history, right? What for instance, the Black Lives Matter movement. How does that relate to history? This is history repeating itself. People say, right? Or does history repeat itself? No, it just rhymes. It means that it repeats itself but in a slightly different version, right? So students are often surprised, like you mentioned and Reina mentioned that the Irish were subject to so much abuse, and not just in the military. I mean, the military, the reason it was happening in the military because those soldiers were part of U.S. society, but it was happening in U.S. society. If you look at cartoons at the time, they're just depicting the Irish in the most brutal ways. Um, you know, as being directed by the Pope, as half ape. I mean, these are things that students who aren't familiar with that history are surprised because they think, well, the Irish are white, right? There's a book called How the Irish Became White, right? That traces what has occurred. But anyway, so I would say this is a great moment. I mean, I'm not going to say obviously these are tragic events that have happened. This is a great sort of learning moment to 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 direct people and students in general, but everyone here is a student of history, of literature, to direct them and say this. Let's find out why this continues, right? And why there's so much reverence for the Texas Rangers, that a football team, I mean a baseball team, sorry, is named after them, right? and there's very little question about it. Why there was a statue up until 2020 of a Texas Ranger that was basically preventing the integration of a high school. Why does that occur? I think it's a complicated history. And I'll say one other thing. So when I was at the University of Iowa, one of my doctoral students wrote a dissertation on Tejano Texas Rangers. So it wasn't just Anglo Americans who were Texas Rangers. There was a few Tejanos who were part of this, just like there are scores of Tejanos and Mexican Americans in the U.S. Border Patrol, right, who are committing some of these abuses. So I often say that people in the valley, I grew up in the valley, we all have some relative who's part of the border patrol. All of us, some distant relative. It's like 3 degrees of separation. So anyway, I would just say learn more. I mean, learn more about this history and encourage others to learn more. Encourage people to go to the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center and learn about that life and death on the border, because I think that's one way to try to change things.
Yeah, and then we got to put pressure too, right, on our political leaders and our schools to make sure that they are teaching this history. Because if we don't learn our history, then we don't know it, and then we cannot ask those questions. Why is this happening? Where is it coming from? What happened before that is impacting what we're doing today and what's happening today? All right. So one more question, and okay. All right. For the distance between us, yeah. It's been really such a wonderful experience. The book came out uh, 11 years ago, this August, and it has been a very special book, because it allowed me to connect with the community that I'm writing about, the undocumented child immigrants, and thinking about these experiences, thinking about immigration and the trauma of being an immigrant and what that's like. And for me, like, that has been one of the most special things is when I come into like schools, the teachers reach out to me and they say, oh, by reading your book I understand my students better. And being invited to come into the schools and talk to these students and connect with them, and for them to be able to see that their stories matter, and that being a border crosser, being an immigrant, that's our superpower, and to learn not to be ashamed of those experiences, but to own them, to celebrate them, and to understand that we have every right to live in this country, to make a home here, and to thrive, not just survive, but learning how to thrive in this country. So yeah, no, well, thank you so much for reading that book. Yes. Mm. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming, and thank you so much for sharing this space with me. And we're gonna be here in the room. If you have any other questions, we'll be happy to continue the discussion. And also, we have some books here for sale, so we'll be happy to sign your books too. Thank you.
I want to thank everybody for coming out today, and especially from the bottom of our hearts, the Latino Collection and Resource Center at San Antonio Public Library. Thank you, Reyna and Omar. And yes, the Latino Bookstore has books for sale. You can get them signed and meet and greet. Follow the LCRC on Facebook. We have a lot of great programming coming up for the Hispanic Heritage Month fall season. So thank you.